All right, good evening. I'd like to call to order the February 28th, 2023 work session. And I'd like to announce to the public who may be listening that the meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream with recordings from previously held meetings can be found on the school board YouTube channel. At this time, I'd like to move on to item 4, curriculum. Item 4.01, academic programs, data update. And before we start, I'd like to apologize, especially to the students who came here on time. We are running a little behind tonight, so I apologize for you having to sit here this extra time. We look forward to hear what you have to say. So, Dr. Leidy.
Yes, thanks. And out of respect for our students, I'm just going to turn it over to Mr. Bitts and let him get started. So go for it.
Thank you. So we're here tonight for a couple presentations, and this first one is looking at one of our data updates, which we've been doing here for the last couple of years. And as we go through, I think you'll see a similar theme as what we've done in the past, starting with some enrollment information and then some different data points from this past marking period, which obviously you previously had seen some data points from the beginning of the year data that we had done with our students. But this year, or this time around, when we look at the enrollment data, we really want to zoom in for you on a particular subset of our population, and that's our English learner population. So just from a very broad brush perspective, I'm gonna make a very simplified statement. It's much more complex, as you can imagine, than this. But our English learners are students who have qualified through some testing to be identified as what used to be back in the day called English as a second language. Students who would have come here from another country, speak a different language as their primary or home language, and are learning English now being in our schools. Some of those students may be newcomers, meaning that they are coming directly from another country and from speaking that other primary language directly into our schools. Some may have been in our country for a while and begun to learn English already, and may be what we look at as other levels within the English learner program. And some students actually become fluent enough in English that they go on to a monitor status, where they receive less support on a day-to-day basis, but still have monitoring from one of our English as a second language professionals. So that's, again, a very quick overview of what's a much more complex program than that, but just to give you an idea of the students that we're talking about. So looking at the enrollment for this group, we really think it's important for the board to gain an understanding of what we're seeing. And that's really the point of these data updates, is to bring you up to speed with some of the trends we're seeing. And this first box really just gives you a snapshot of where we are right now as of marking period 2, and there's some longitudinal data that you'll look at here in a couple minutes. But right now we have a total of 273 students who are qualified as English learners. And the second box there is important to note that 110 of those 273 are new to MASD this school year. Obviously, all of our kindergartners are new to us, so 36 of those students are kindergartners. But then another 74 are in grades 1 through 12. Just for perspective's sake, going back to 18-19, 19-20, we'll skip over the pandemic year because that's different in so many ways, and last year, typically we have in the 70s of the number of students who are new to MASD as L students. And that's at this time of year each year. So we're more than 40 over that already for this school year. When we look at it by grade band, you can see some total numbers there, looking at kindergarten 1 through 3, 4, 5, and middle and high school, but then also the percent total of the enrollment at each of those levels. So you can see at this point, 36 kindergartners amounts to just over 10% of our kindergarten population qualifies as L's right now. And then the high, trying to move me ahead. The high, of course, being at Elmwood at 8%. You can see the reduced numbers at middle school and high school. part of that is because of that structure that I described for you, that certainly as students are in our system for a number of years, hopefully they are going to monitor status and then even testing out. So it's not necessarily reflective of those lower numbers of students who may not have been qualified as an L at one time, but maybe by middle and high school have been able to achieve that status of testing out of being qualified as an English learner. This next table and graph will show you by school year. And you can see down there at the bottom, I think is there one more year underneath there, making sure? Yeah, there we go. So starting in 2013-14, we were at 112 students total. And that kind of stands out just from the perspective of that number at the beginning where we said we've had 110 new students this year. That was our total altogether back in 13-14, which was just under 3% of our total enrollment. And obviously you can see that that's grown. The one dip there being in 21-22, and we did see during the pandemic, which obviously was primarily the year prior to that, but over the course of that year, we saw a number of our families make the choice to move back to their home country for a year and have, in a number of cases, moved back to us again, but did leave the country during the pandemic. So moving on to the next one. This will show you, I think this reveals even the increase of numbers, the diversity of the population we're speaking of. You can see this goes from 2018 to the far right, moving to the most recent numbers on your left. And this talks about the number of languages, the number of students whose home language is being spoken, and the percent of the L population that represents. And you can see Somali, as I think many of you know, was a population that was quite prominent in this group, and that was, as of 2018, up to around 61% of our Ls were speaking Somali, but that is now down to actually 30%. And at the same time, we see that Spanish has increased quite a bit, and I think for me, I'm struck by the number of languages that we had zeros of back in 2018, and now we have fairly significant populations. Whether you look at Nepalese, Persian, you can see we went from 0 to 13, Telugu 0 to 7, Vietnamese 0 to 7, and Swahili 0 to 5. In total, 28 spoken languages in Mechanicsburg Area School District, as far as we know, as of January 2023. So again, not all of those languages are spoken by students who qualify as Ls, but are home languages that we know.
Real quick, Andy, it's particularly Spanish, like so many people, especially even from a territory of the U.S., come here, they're bilingual to begin with. Do they count in any way towards that?
So,
or is it based on their individual ability to?
So this is grouped by students who are in all of those levels. I don't have the figures to be able to say, do most of those Spanish, or most of them being monitored as opposed to being newcomers or anything like that. We could certainly get that data.
No, I was just curious, like if you knew offhand. Like,
I don't know.
But they, to your point, they qualify for some type of service from us that's on this list. As opposed to,
they don't have to prove, I guess, that they need the assistance. They qualify just by nature.
so no, if someone comes in bilingual, they can speak Spanish, but they also speak English, they don't necessarily qualify for.
Okay, so it's looked at, each student is looked at individually
Yeah.
based on their ability
And test
to
it.
speak
Yeah.
English versus their other language that may not even be native, it may be bilingual from birth, so, okay. Just with that group rising, I was just curious how that's subgroup.
And there's various components to that test. It's speaking, listening, reading. There's a number of different components. We're going to shift gears away from our English learners, but maybe I'll give you a chance if there's any other questions specifically about that data.
How do we support 20 different languages?
That's a fantastic question. And ultimately, One thing at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about one program that our ESSER funds are actually going to support here coming up this summer. But it's definitely something that our current L teachers and Mr. Bigham and our new supervisor of student services, I think I got the title right, Bethany Bridges, who's going to be in charge of working with that department, is constantly looking at how do we support all of these students. And certainly as we look ahead to next year's budget and some staffing requests and programmatic requests that are going to be coming forward, you'll definitely see this data reflected in those requests.
And I just want to point out too, I've seen invoices where we bring them on site for like all day long because they have the teacher-parent conferences and the parents don't speak, so they have to have an interpreter here.
There's a language line. We've got a number of, and obviously a tremendous group of teachers right now. One at the high school, one at the middle school, multiple at the elementary level, a half-time at kindergarten, who are doing an amazing job with it. But obviously the numbers continue to rise. So that question is exactly the question that we've been asking ourselves. And again, you'll see and hear more as we look towards the budget.
Does every school of the 500 has to provide the same level as we do in terms of this sort of?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of schools in Pennsylvania that don't have any L's at all. This region in particular, some of you may remember a few years ago, we looked at census data through the University of Pennsylvania and how the demographics were changing in our area, and you're seeing that significantly moving on to the West Shore. We have about 10% L's in our kindergarten class. Central Dauphin, for instance, is 25% L's. And so, yeah, it's changing. We do not get a tremendous amount of guidance from either the state or the federal government on L's. And that's challenging at times. And then dealing with 28 different languages, you're really trying to get them with immersion into the English language as opposed to using their language. It's tough.
So do we get grant money like for anything like that? I mean, like, I know you probably
It's-
have to know. but
ESSER
like-
money, right?
We can use the ESSER money. That's our choice to use the ESSER money, and because of this demographic and these numbers, we've chosen to. But
That's not like special ed money,
the
right?
title, we get some Title III money, but I got to tell you, it's pennies on what we really need. So yes, there's some that comes with some strings attached to it, but it's I don't want to say insignificant, but by comparison, it's not a lot.
And the reality for the ESSER money, obviously we're looking for some specialized pilots to be able to use it as we'll talk about, but this is going to be an ongoing expense. So we have to look to our general fund to be able to see how we can fund it.
Have we received any children from like the immigration coming over the border? Like, you know, that they're going to other states or other cities?
What, Mr. Bigham?
We do have some immigrant students, yes. But the large portion of that population is not here in Mechanicsburg Area School. But we're not immune to receiving immigrant students.
So Camp Hill finishes building their wall, and then, you know, we'll end up with the, so. Sorry, go ahead, please, next section.
So moving to discipline incidents. So again, that was really the enrollment piece that we tried to bring forward each time in a different light as to what's standing out. Discipline is one that we've looked at fairly regularly. So this is just the update on where we were here in marking period 2 and in comparison to last year. Obviously, in terms of number of incidents, and encouraging to see the number of incidents go down that in the past we've seen go up in marking period 2, but obviously we've seen that more students have been involved in.
And this is across all students.
Yes, yeah, yep. Important distinction, I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, I thought so, but no.
Yeah. The passing rates, again, figure that we've been seeing over time, and ultimately see those continuing to stay about where they've been for the middle school, and also for the high school. Our early reading, this is where our elementary screening data comes in. So this, again, the screeners are to be able to wave the yellow flag on a particular student to say you need to dig deeper and see what this student needs. And it's also to show us the health of our overall program, our overall what we call Tier 1 academic program and our curriculum. So 80% would indicate the strongest health that we would be looking for in being in low risk. And you can see that for early reading, which is our screener for kindergartners and first graders, we went to 71% here at the middle of the year. And of that 71%, 82% of kindergartners were low risk on the middle of the year screening. So that was great news for kindergarten and the work that they've been doing. And then because we're looking at beginning of the year to middle of the year, we do some growth data as well. So we can see that 61% of our students between the beginning of the year and the middle of the year showed what we consider to be typical or aggressive growth. So perhaps catching up even. And obviously, typical or aggressive growth, that could be students that were high risk and remain in high risk, but they are showing strong growth even despite that they're having challenges.
Why would the high risk increase from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year?
Well, it could be a number of factors. One could be the number of L's that we just talked about a little bit earlier. It could be just showing some other indications of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, strengthening the top end, but also some of the low end being more high risk as well.
Differentiated, like our approach to walk to reading, be addressing this, and we would see the high risk improve. I know what you're saying, that the high risk can improve but still be high risk, but
Sure.
we this program's kind of built in now, right? So you would think that there would be.
I would frame it a little bit differently than specifically walk to reading as a program. I would frame it from the perspective of when we talk about reading as part of our academic program, we have the core reading, our ELA curriculum that our teachers are teaching, which has reading incorporated with it, but also the writing pieces and word work, and all of that is included within ELA. And then we also have, particularly at the primary level, this element of teaching students to read at their level. And in that case, intervention also comes into play, which might look in some buildings like the walk to reading model, as you described it. At kindergarten, it's a different model that we use for intervention. But to your point, the idea is certainly that 12% of students all but guarantee that a vast majority of that high-risk group is receiving intervention in some form or fashion. And certainly that intervention should be, if not moving them to some risk, it should be helping them have typical or aggressive growth. And if it's not for a particular student, then that's when that yellow flag is waving and we need to dig deeper to see why isn't this intervention working that we've been using.
Probably in a similar line of questioning, the 61% of students that are seeing typical or aggressive growth, the typical really shines out to me. I would assume our target is more around 100%. I know it's not 100%, but do we put corrective actions in place when we see that it's at 61%? That just feels too low to me.
Yeah, that 60% has generally been about where we have been, but we also know that we have work to do within our ELA curriculum. Even the 71% is too low. We need to see that go higher as well. So right now, this year, we've been really focusing our Tier 1 efforts on our math curriculum, but our math curriculum is still needing to grow some too. So I would agree. I think it's a growth number that we need to see go up, one that we need to keep working on. So A reading is the next one. This is a more general reading assessment, and this is given 2nd through 7th grade to all students. There are some students in 8th grade, and even in high school, that take some of these assessments. Specifically at the high school, it's our special education students to be able to get some 3 times a year data on. But the students that all take it are 2nd through 7th grade, and there you can see the numbers, percentages across those grades.
I have the same comment on the 62% finish. It just feels like, I explained a lot of it away with COVID, and they weren't in the building, and to still see those numbers is really disappointing.
But something like that takes a period of time to recover. It's not a,
But typical
Quick
growth
fix.
doesn't feel like that's what takes the time to recover. That for me is why I'm stuck on it. I get you, low risk, all of those categories, but to get typical growth, it feels like if we've got them in our building, then we're doing something wrong if we're not getting typical growth.
Yeah, it's an indicator of where the tier 1 is, where our tier 1 curriculum is for sure.
a question that comes to mind for me, because I had some of those same thoughts, but how much of that could be an indicator also that there's not support outside of school at the level there needs to be? Because is it realistic to think that strictly based on what the time we have with the student in school, we can move them, they can move without some supports outside?
Our goal traditionally has been to get to 80%.
Okay.
Right, we feel like if we have a solid tier 1 program in place, we should be able to get to 80%. And then beyond that, some of that is what we're saying, we still have an obligation to those kids. So we're not in disagreement that this is not what we would hope it to be. As part of coming back and stabilizing the curriculum, at the same time, you have teachers that are responsible at the elementary level teaching across the board in K-3, right? And so stabilizing that curriculum, the focus has been on math, although those numbers aren't extraordinary either. So you're seeing what we're seeing. And
So, are you saying this year we focused on math, where last year we were focusing on reading?
now I'm saying this year we're focusing on stabilizing math coming out of COVID, because when we went into COVID and said to teachers, just teach them something, what happened to a very guaranteed and viable curriculum became more of a splintered curriculum based on the individual teacher. So now to bring that back to guaranteed and viable, it took us, 10 years to get there to begin with. So now we're trying to bring it back within a year for math and then another year for reading.
Are we still having the extra reading time this year like we did last year?
Yeah, intervention is layered on top of this.
And I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to absolve us of responsibility,
Mhm.
but I think it's a factor we have to consider. I think back to when we did the initial testing on Kindergarten Academy, there was a big jump, if I recall, at the end of the year, a full day kindergarten. But then when kids came back in the fall, a lot of that, at least the initial testing, I think, a lot of that was no longer there. And just,
Dr. Lebo, the question you're asking is exactly when I talk about that yellow flag waving and the team coming and digging deeper, those are the exact kind of questions they're asking as part of that is, okay, well, what's going on with the student? Because this doesn't tell the whole story. It's really meant as a holistic look. Are we at that 80%, which obviously we can see where we are in comparison to that. But once you start digging in, that's when you start asking those more specific questions.
But we always have that fallback. I always remember it's like 11 or 13 weeks to catch up to where you were when you left in the spring, right? Or at the end of the year when you start again over the summer?
yeah, but I just think back to some of the presentations we've had related to social workers, and I think we'd all agree that some of the trauma crises outside of school are increasing. That's got to have an impact.
It's very real.
I agree with what you're
I agree
saying.
too.
I think that I don't know what more we could do. Like, we've stripped away the elementary curriculum to be reading and math, essentially, right? Like, there's more to it. Not that there's specials.
A lot of
No,
people would push
No,
back on
no,
that.
but no, just That's what we're looking at, though. We're reading and math scores. We're not looking at a science score or history. And there are specials and there's some other work that they do for sure. But like that's why we built the buildings and configure them the way they are to do this. So like I don't know how much more you can, you spend an hour and a half in the morning on reading for a first grader. Like that's about the capacity I feel like you can have, right? I mean, what you tell us that is. So I don't disagree that there needs to be more support at home and you got to keep reading it at night. But like I feel like the amount of input we're giving them, I feel like we should be in better shape too.
Well, I think it's how do we continue to make that time better? Because you're right, there's only so many minutes that we can add to a program one way or the other, but how can we make that curriculum better? And I think we're doing it right now with math, although the data doesn't necessarily show us getting to the point where we hope to be ultimately, but we know that there's things with ELA as well. And frankly, the point you made is exactly where I think we can get better is how do we integrate more of social studies and science to make our ELA and math curriculum come alive? And we've got some planning going on to do just that, but I think there are things within that hour and a half, or
Whatever
just
the-
throw that
is,
number
yeah.
out, that can make that curriculum better for students.
And there's certainly, we've seen it, like history comes through the writing that they're talking about or they're showing things, but it really is like reading and writing and math at this point, so.
Yeah, and it's not for us to micromanage, I think it's just for us to reinforce that I don't think 62 is good enough, I don't think you think 62 is good enough, but I think we should be reinforcing it's not.
Yep.
We need to figure it out.
Agreed.
We're all in agreement with that. I think.
We wouldn't want you to not be genuine. We appreciate you giving genuine questions and feedback. That's why we share it. So moving to math, there's a couple data points that we'll share there for early math, kindergarten to first grade. So there you can see the numbers for achievement and again for growth. And then the second set, this time it's second through fifth grade. The middle school hasn't done this one to this point, but all second through fifth graders take this one as a general math assessment. Again, screener. Those are our percentages there for that.
Would there be a differential if we did look at typical and aggressive growth together?
I would say that in most of them, very generally, typical is higher than aggressive.
It just to make sure that I'm not missing it by really focusing in on it.
So the last piece I want to share, again, is a little bit different than maybe what we've shared in past data updates, but I think it speaks to some of the questions and discussion that we've already had here, as well as I think it's important that we continue to update you on the programs that we've been using the ESSER funds for. One of those being what last summer was our first time with what we called the Full Steam Ahead program. It was an elementary summer program for students. We've got just a few snapshots of information here for you about that. The goal of this wasn't necessarily to push students further, even though exceeding where they were when they left in the spring would be wonderful. Really, as Mrs. Morgan said earlier, we were trying to avoid that summer slide. We know that research shows us that, particularly for some students, that summer slide is a very real thing, and that students do experience some loss over the summer months. So we want to be able to target those students who are most at risk for having that loss between spring and fall, and also try and incorporate some other activities, some virtual field trips, some STEAM activities to be able to engage students. Huge kudos goes to Mr. McIntosh and his group, Damina Petty, one of our teachers. She helped to head this up last summer, and Mr. McIntosh has taken this on as another project for this summer as well. It's 5 weeks through the summer. We were able to last year have 55 students involved who had just finished first, second, or third grade, and 7 teachers. And you can see the percentages of students who either maintained or in some cases increased their achievement between the spring and the fall was strong. 76 in the reading screener and 60% of students in the broad math screener. So some nice outcomes there from that. We are looking for this upcoming summer to once again use ESSER funds as they continue to be available and expand it to our current kindergartners moving on to first grade, but otherwise maintain the overall structure.
So I'm assuming that's like a volunteer thing. Like if parents can't get a child here 4 days a week for 5 weeks, or 4 days a week, 5 weeks.
So we've provided transportation for that, which was very helpful for a number of our families to be able to engage. I couldn't tell you how many of the 55 students took advantage of that, but I know certainly a number of them did. But it was, officially, we asked them to commit to 4 of the 5 weeks. If they had a vacation one of those weeks, so be it, but if they couldn't commit to 4 of the 5, then we didn't have them for the program. It just wouldn't have benefited them.
And what grades was that again?
Last summer, it was students who had just finished first, second, and third, but this summer we'll be adding students who just finished kindergarten as well.
Will we be able to expand it to more than 55 then, or will it still be limited?
It's limited as much by the number of staff that we can get as well for a chunk of that 5-week time. So we are looking to be able to expand it maybe closer to 70, but we'll see how it all shakes out.
I know we have some community partners that do tutoring and some things like that. Is there any room for volunteers to be a part of that could increase that capacity?
So part of what we were committed to with this program was ensuring that the teachers were highly trained professionals. So that's not to suggest that some volunteers might not fit that bill, but ultimately this was something that we were looking for a certain acumen, if you will, for the folks, which isn't necessarily the case for all programs. So I appreciate the question, but we are looking for trained teachers this one.
Were there other barriers to this program for students to be able to come and get it? Vacations might have impacted, but were there other things that we could potentially look to solution for so that we could have more students this year or different students?
I don't know that there were particular trends across that. There were certainly individual families that declined for a variety of reasons, but the biggest trend was simply scheduling, that it wasn't something that they were interested in trying to fit into their summer schedule.
Well, and I sort of get that from the daytime. I assume it was the same hours as school hours, and I anticipate
Just a
if you
lunch, but
work a full day, 8 to 5, is there an after-school component that was needed to make them more able to do that? And could we partner with our rec program to do that? I don't know.
I believe there were a few students that were coming from summer adventure camp and being a part of it during those
And we
days,
were able to work
and
with
then
them to do that.
coming back and forth. Again, I couldn't tell you how many, but
That was my question. Could we, we have a ton of kids in summer adventure camp. Could we start just slipping books in their
There's a lot of that in summer adventure
I
camp.
imagine there is, but like.
So
Go to the
if you-
library.
Yeah.
You're not that far off, because if you remember what this came from was actually 2 summers ago. We had done just that. We had partnered specifically with Summer Adventure Camp, and instead we had taken teachers to Summer Adventure Camp, and they provided some tutoring there. I think it was 2 days a week off the top of my head, that they were meeting with specific students that they had identified who had already registered for Summer Adventure Camp, and they said, ooh, they could use this too. So that kind of evolved into this, and yeah, saw some good success at least this first year. So this will be one, as the other programs I'll more briefly explain, that we'll continue to monitor and keep our eyes on, because obviously when the ESSER funds run out, it's a matter of us making the decision of, okay, if this is something we're committed to, then we need to be able to roll it into our general fund.
So how many of those 55 kids are the EL kids?
I don't know off the top of my head. I do know there were some. It wasn't a majority of those students. This was really targeted. It's a good question. It was really targeted for students who weren't necessarily our lowest students. These were students that we were just trying to protect from that summer slide. So it wasn't an intervention. We do have some other interventions in place for some of those students. And actually the last one, I'll skip over 2 bullets and go to the pilot program. for the English Language Development Program this upcoming summer, Mr. Bigham is working with a number of our teachers to put together a similar kind of program, but specifically for our English language students. So this would be the first year for us doing that.
Are they focusing on reading? Or
They'll be focusing on reading, language-based acquisition skills, and we're certainly going to focus on math, because math is important.
And fourth,
It will be targeted for fourth grade and fifth grade and potentially incoming third to fourth grade students.
And to your point about the ESSER funding and it running out, so which budget year do we need to make that decision? Is it this coming budget?
so we're still good for this budget, for this summer, and when you talk about the middle school extended school day program, that will be fine for next school year, so next year's budget is fine. But next budget for the year following is when we would have to incorporate
And sense of cost?
it. Different for each one of these.
I mean, all of it, because all of it's what we're gonna have to decide on.
Yeah, it's a little different for each one. I think, for example, the extended school day program, we just talked about that this morning, that was
Around 40.
40,000 for that one. That's 2 days a week, all year long. And that's students, similar population that we're talking about, or targeted group as we're talking about here for elementary, but it's students that stay for an extended day, 2 days a week after school to be able to get some homework help, get some organizational help, executive functioning help, and they're seeing some positive results from that as well.
And so if we find we're getting positive results from it all, 100,000 that we're gonna have to bake into another budget is a good round number?
I think depending on, yeah, I would say 100,000 between the elementary program and the middle school program. And then there's instructional coaching, which is more of a staffing piece, which would be in addition to the 100.
Yeah, it won't stop at 100,000, and that's part of the challenge, is we've got to look at, this was nice having assessor money, but is it working? And so that's why we're looking at this data too, trying to decide. And part of the challenge, this goes back to the other question, is 3 months enough? Is 4 months enough, right? And in something like this, are you seeing the impact, or are we cutting it off too soon because we're not seeing the impact? And it's the age-old challenge of education, which is really why we keep having more of a benefits-based accountability discussion than just purely the number discussion. So.
Well, and the reason I ask is I appreciate that in a few years, we're not gonna be the only ones losing ESSER funding. The
Right.
state's gonna be short on funding, everybody's gonna be short on money, and it's all gonna come together at the
Yep.
same time. So
Exactly.
seeing if there's ways we can bake it into other pieces of our budget so that we're not left with, sorry, this program's gotta go, and you're not seeing anything come along. So.
I think the second bullet there speaks to the support that you've given to us being able to do that a little bit. Last year, you supported us getting one additional instructional coach position that we used for an instructional coach at the high school. So that's a contracted position, but through the ESSER funds, we were then able to add another instructional coach, which we're using at the middle school. So in that case, that's one where your support has allowed us to kind of, over time, be able to add to the general fund. So that's it for the data update.
Very good.
Any further questions to Mr. Betts? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to item 4.02, student dress code. And before I turn this over to Dr. Leidy, I'd just like to say is, many months ago when Dr. Leidy and I had first discussed this, that the need to look at this and readdress it, we looked at the different approaches, and he asked me if I wanted to assign a board member to the committee that they put together. But after we talked for a little while, I really thought, in this case, it was better not to. That, I mean, it is, obviously, it's a legal function of the board, of the school code, that the board makes the dress code. But I thought the committee approach works so well. I would rather have a committee that the board's not involved with, that, through Mr. Harris and the other leaders, they could reach out to parents, students, and then come forward with a recommendation to us that we can, we can accept it, we can reject it, we can modify it. Ultimately, we do that. But I wanted to hear not only what they had to say, but also why they came to that conclusion, because they're the ones that deal with it every day. So That's kind of the approach we took, and I don't even know what committee they set up, we'll get to that.
So we'll talk about that tonight.
And then from this meeting forward, it's in our hands, that all 9 of us, rather than, it's like one person on a committee, so that's how we came to that conclusion for this, so. With that,
Yeah, so we've been talking about dress code, as Mr. Rupp said, and the ultimate goal of this is to come back to our policy. We have board policy on dress code, but tonight we're just basically introducing the work of the committee and some of the recommendations that came out of the committee, and then next month we'll be bringing forward the actual language and policy associated with that. So.
It would be easy to look at this topic and not want to tackle it. Let's put it that way. But frankly, I'm excited about it, and it's something that I've really felt good about the process that we've gone through and being a part of it. I'm glad that I got the chance to be a part of it so far, because at the end of the day, what I've come to learn from the many conversations we've had with all different kinds of stakeholders is that people want something that's fair, people want something that's clear, and ultimately if having a few difficult conversations along the way helps us get to that point, then I'm here for it. So I think the rest of the committee would say the same thing, that it's been worthwhile work, and anytime you can say that and see that it's going to benefit students in the end is something we can feel good about. So the theme of the presentation is pictures from past yearbooks. I don't know that anybody in the room here is pictured at all, but if you are, you can decide whether you want to admit to your picture
Is
being.
that you in 1989?
I didn't go to Kingsburg, so that's
It's
none of,
like you there at the
none
Penn
of them
State
is me.
Jersey.
Looks like John a little bit.
I was long out of school by those days,
But we,
as you very well know.
we have the opportunity here tonight to talk about a few parts of this committee work. And as Dr. Leidy shared a little bit about, the point of tonight is not to give you the first reading of the policy. The point of tonight is to talk about the philosophical underpinnings, if you will, of the policy. Why are we looking at this in the first place? And ultimately, what did we as a committee come up with as the structure beneath the policy? And then as you'll see towards the end, you'll be seeing the first reading of the policy itself at the next meeting. But I'll certainly be previewing quite a few pieces about the policy here tonight. And we've got some guests that have been so patient, and we appreciate them being with us, and they'll be speaking in addition to Mr. Harris here along the way as well. So we'll start out talking about why are we examining this in the first place? What's the compelling why? What's the impetus for us taking a look at this? But then talking to you about the process that Mr. Rupp talked a little bit about, the committee, who was a part of the committee, ultimately what we defined as our guiding values as we came up with the policy changes, and then ultimately give you a chance to hear from some of the stakeholders. We have a few written statements, and again, we have some guests that I know are going to do a great job, and I couldn't be more proud of the work they did on the committee with us. So why examine the dress code? Our old dress code, it was from, or it is, I should say, because it's still the one that's on the books, is from 1999. We had a 2002 revision, so 21 years ago was the last time that we had any revisions to this. If you go back 21 years prior to the 99 adoption, that would be in the 70s. So you can think we're one adoption away from a dress code that may have existed in the 70s. But the point is, it's a long time for us not to have done anything with the dress code. And as we look at the opportunity to honor the diversity that's in our district and make sure that our students not only are included here, but ultimately feel that they belong in our district. And we just saw the numbers. We just saw the diversity that we're seeing in the district in numeric form. This is something that we really have to do. Ultimately, diversity is a characteristic. As soon as you have two people in a room, you've got diversity. But it's about how do you make sure that diverse voices feel included and feel that they belong in a space. And part of that ultimately is acknowledging and recognizing their identity and some of the things that make them unique culturally, religiously, from all different kinds of perspectives. So we need to be able to adapt to the way that our society and our community is changing as well, and we need to be able to do that with our dress code.
How does the dress code not honor it now?
We'll get there,
Okay.
I promise. Case law. Case law is another reason. Ultimately, we know that the Constitution, Title IX, Title VI, all guarantee equal protection in a lot of different cases. And ultimately, case law has shown, particularly in recent years, and Stock and Leader has been very clear with us in different sessions that they have held, how much case law has changed regarding dress code. And the idea ultimately that that things would be a substantial disruption, which is ultimately what Tinker versus Des Moines said something had to be in the case. That was the case where the students wore the armbands, and ultimately they had been expelled, and ultimately that case was thrown out. So it's constantly a big court case in school law that you talk about. Ultimately, that case said that there had to be a substantial disruption to the learning environment. And what qualifies as a substantial disruption has, you could say, decreased, if you will, in the court's eyes quite a bit over recent years. Things that might be in the past a slogan or a picture of a gun on a shirt. Even in these times as we think about the challenges of gun violence, in the past perhaps we would have said, no, you can't wear that at school. But now, ultimately, just having that could be seen as a political statement and not necessarily as a threat or a substantial disruption. So that standard has changed, and the case law definitely has carried that through. Enforceability is another piece to this, and it goes a little bit to your question, Mr. Sanker, of what are some of the challenges that we have with our current policy, and we'll get even more to that. I want to give Mr. Harris a chance to speak a little bit on the specifically to enforceability, but also what at the high school really rose over the last couple of years for him and for administration that has made this something we want to tackle.
Yeah, I think obviously the enforceability really lies in the 3 bullet points above. If we enforce the dress code to the letter of the law, we would have long ago been in the court of law for our enforcement of it. For example, the image on the screen of those 2 beautiful young ladies, they're violating the dress code as it's currently written. Our dress code is very clear, no head coverings of any kind. All right, it was outdated. Probably at the time it was revised, and I don't know that it reflected that in our community, but soon thereafter things changed. And so enforceability, we've had to evolve, and I've been involved with enforcing the dress code at the high school for almost 20 years, depending on who you talk to. Sometimes you're criticized for the perceived lack of enforcement of dress code. It's interesting, things change over time. Things that staff were upset about 10 years ago are now actually a part of staff attire on a school day because of how cultural things change as well. So you've got certainly that case law and the changing demographics of our community, but then I think more importantly, and as importantly, not more importantly, we've become just more aware. It is very easy to look at the world through your lens and make a justification of why something is acceptable, why something is not. And you know, just certainly prior to the events of 2020 and the closure, we really began to pay closer attention to some of the needs, looking at it through student lens. We are obviously a predominantly white Caucasian community, but more so faculty, lawmaking body, and we only bring to that our experiences. And found there were some things from a cultural perspective that we just didn't understand about our students, and we learned that from talking to our students. We learned that from engaging in book studies. We learned that from engaging in even dialogue as in detail as the trip with teachers to Alabama last summer as an example. So it's the combination of all those things, and the best example I could probably give you, there are certain things in terms of a religious head covering versus a ball cap. There is a difference, and we do enforce them differently. Not sure how case law sees that, but we do enforce them differently. But we might say to a student, you can't have a hat or hood, only to find out later on, learning a little bit more. I learned from a young man who was identified as African American about just the complexity of hair and getting it prepared for school, and the choice of come to school or don't come to school because I can't get my hair ready. And it's not as simple as me getting in the shower for 10 minutes and being able to comb my hair. And that's not something I knew anything about or could possibly comprehend until I opened my eyes a little bit and opened my ears a little bit and listened. And so that doesn't make it any easier to enforce it either. There's still people who, have strong opinions, and for good reason. But again, a policy also is only as good as its enforceability. And so, at the high school level, I think it's true throughout the system, but very true at the high school level. It can't be the work of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. It's got to be something that everybody feels comfortable engaging in. And I know that isn't the case necessarily at the high school. I'm hoping that through the work of the committee involving students who said, we feel this way, in addition to parent involvement and staff involvement, that we've got something that people can feel comfortable making the referrals to the administration as necessary. Some do very much, and some don't feel that they want to do that because, again, that word belonging, when that kid comes to school and we say, well, you can't wear that here, that is the beginning of not belonging. Now, there are still some things that are not acceptable, and that does exist in the policy. So I think that's kind of the timeline from mid-2000, first decade, if you will, to the present. Some just some sudden changes in our community and population, but then really more so our increasing awareness, understanding, listening to the different groups that we have who can contribute to the conversation.
So with that as the backdrop, we formed a committee which had 6 students on, 2 of which are with us here this evening. It was a number of students from across grade levels, all high school based, but definitely a good diverse group of students that participated. We had a number of parents because some of us, counting in other groups, are also parents, but we had one person who was specifically there as a parent, a non-staff member, who's been in our district and contributes a lot to these kinds of efforts. We had 4 teachers be a part, a school counselor, and then 2 administrators. Dr. Rudisil was an important part of this committee, and really, from a high school perspective, was helping with Mr. Harris to head this group. We had some continuous reviews, so other groups that have looked at this and spoken into it. After the high school did some initial work, then we were able to take that to elementary, intermediate, middle, to be able to have those folks be able to speak into it as well. I know, well, Mr. Yu is here, but I know the principals from those levels would say that over the last couple of years, in this very similar timeline to what Mr. Harris spoke of, they've been asking the same question of when's the time to look at this, because for all those same reasons that he just talked about. So they were hungry for this as well.
And so that is the intent, that it will be for all, not just the high school. I notice in particular sometimes at the middle school is where we started to see this becoming a heightened attention.
Yes, and in fact, our current policy even is written as an elementary code and a secondary code. They're very, very similar, but they are separate pieces. But we are looking now for it to be one standard code as well.
And at some point, I'm assuming you focused on like, why do we have a dress code?
Yep. Other groups then, district administration and solicitor, and of course this group. We want to be able to have this group speak into it as well. So what are the values that are guiding this work for us? And I think this will speak a little bit to the why have a dress code, and also speak to the reasons that are currently in the policy for why to have a dress code, and why some shifting of that logic needs to happen. So when we're talking about the old policy says right now, a phrase, for example, prepare for eventual employment. There's a section at the beginning of our current dress code that talks about this idea of safety and security certainly as being part of it. That's often trumpeted as part of the reason for having a dress code, but then also this idea of professionalism and preparing them for the workforce. I don't think any of us would suggest that preparing our students for the workforce isn't still part of what we do. But the reality is that if we're counting on the dress code to be able to do that, then we're missing the mark. Because dress code should really be about comfort and engagement for our students. That's what we want our students to be able to come here and do. My kids would wear, and pretty much do, wear sweats every day, and it certainly meets the letter of the code of the dress code. They're clothed fine to be able to engage, and they're comfortable throughout the day. But they also know that they're not going to be able to wear that when they go for a job interview or some of those kinds of things. But also, even the standard of what that looks like has changed over time, as we know, working at home and all those kinds of things. So ultimately, certainly we're an institution that's preparing our students to be able to move on and be able to recognize when it's time to be more dressed up and when it's time to be more casual. But if we're counting on the everyday dress code to do that for us, then we'd be missing the mark. So the value for the new code is really for comfort and engagement, not to promote professionalism. Another value, equitable treatment. Again, I'll give you some of the lines from our current policy that we have. Talks about NEAT is one of the qualifiers that's in there, that we expect students to be neat. We expect them to be clean, themselves, their hair, their clothing, reasonable limits of decency, morality, and propriety. Attracts undue attention. These are some of the things that are in our current policy that, as Mr. Harris, I think, very eloquently talked about, you have some qualifiers there that you have to say by whose standard? Who's deciding what is neat? Who is deciding what clean hair is or what clean clothing is versus something else? Who's deciding what that reasonable limit of decency, morality, and propriety is? Whose standard gets to win the day, particularly when we have such a diverse community around us as we do now? So some of those qualifiers just reek of inequity, as opposed to what we really want to be able to promote, which is for students of all different cultures, all different races, and across gender lines as well, equitable treatment for them. There was a recent study, the Government Accounting Office published this study, and it was ultimately, the accounting office puts out quite a few studies that then gets picked up by other departments within the federal government. Department of Education was picking up this one. It was a study of dress codes and was talking a lot about the degree of disproportionality of dress code violations going towards females, because so many dress codes specifically call out girls and different pieces of clothing that are more specific to females. And in fact, our dress code now specifically says that girls may wear this or not wear this. And we're looking for a more neutral policy that's able to be more equitable for all of our students. So enforceability, Mr. Harris talked a little bit about this, move from command and control towards more family control. Some of these things I'll mention, they are classic, well-known examples of how over the years in all different schools, and not necessarily just here, dress codes have been enforced. Have heard of the two-finger rule, that the strap over your shoulder can't be more than 2 fingers, or the fingertip rule for shorts, that your shorts can't go up any shorter than where your fingertips would fall. There's the old rule of that if you raise your hands above your head and your shirt goes up and you see your midriff, then it's against a dress code. So there's all these different kinds of ways that have been used classically to enforce the dress code that are demeaning or oppressive in all different kinds of reasons. So whose fingers are we putting there? Is it an administrator that's going to go around and touch girls' shoulders to see if their strap is too wide or too skinny? What are we asking students to do to be, doing calisthenics to be able to show that they meet the dress code or not? And quite frankly, the fashion industry isn't doing us any favors with many of these things either, because many of the clothing that our dress codes are requiring students to wear, frankly, just aren't available and depending on your body type and size, which again, we don't want to marginalize somebody just based on how they are, you know, they might not be able to meet the dress code in the same way that another student might be able to with the clothes that are available to them. So again, enforceability, we talk about those kinds of things. We talk about our current policy that talks about outerwear jackets being outlawed. Well, that, again, is pretty near impossible to be able to say, well, this is an outerwear jacket, this is too puffy, this one you can't wear, but that you can wear. That's an enforceability nightmare and doesn't belong in our dress code. Last value of the four that we pointed out was the idea of reducing barriers to attendance. When you have stipulations that may be marginalizing certain groups, then you disproportionately, if you're using a lack of attendance, whether that's just attendance to class until somebody brings you a different set of clothes, or whether it's a more serious violation that you're sending someone home, you're having students having a barrier to attendance simply based on something that, again, may be disproportionately affecting one group or one gender over another. That's something we don't want to do. So we want to hear from some other people. You've heard enough from me and Mr. Harris. Here's some voices from the committee. This one's a statement from our parent, Michelle Dugan, who really spoke to this idea of neutrality. She said the prior version of the policy seemingly and unwittingly had more restrictions imposed upon dress that females might wear. Our recommended changes present greater gender neutrality, which allows more equality for all students to express themselves through their dress. We also had a teacher who talked a little bit more to the enforcement piece. Allison Whitman, one of our high school social studies teachers, said a revised, clear, and concise dress code policy will provide directives from the administration to the staff and serve as a foundation for consistency throughout the building. It will also serve to address the increase of non-instructional disruptive behaviors that serve as a distraction to learning. So speaking to that piece of how can we keep this from being an issue that's taking up instructional time, whether it's the teacher having to address it in class or whether it's a student having to be pulled from class because of a potential issue.
How much of that happens?
A lot less than it used to because our values have started to change, short of the change of the policy. So that, you know, I mean, if you go to the letter of the law, it could happen, should probably happen many times a day.
Yeah, I mean, we actually went through a wave of that in middle school. My daughter was in middle school, and regularly kiddos were getting sent to the office. Call your parents, get rid of those stretch pants, get rid of
Yoga
those.
pants.
You know.
that was the last big one, was yoga pants.
Yep.
Because
I'm like, I
it's
wear
not
yoga
allowed.
pants every minute of every day, and my daughter getting sent home
And Don, I
for it.
wanted to say what you said about why we don't have a dress code. If you heard me laugh, I wasn't laughing at you. I was laughing because when he brought the whole issue up to me, I actually asked him the same question. Like,
Right.
and I know you and I agree on this, like,
Yeah.
why do we even have it? Like, I mean, it's, and I went through the same thing, and people would be sent home, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like,
Right, when did yoga pants become a mortal sin?
and when are shoulders like a private part that has to be covered? Like, don't get me started. That's not what tonight's meeting's for. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I
And
asked a question
yes.
right before you got to the students. So you could get to
Oh,
the
I'm sorry.
students.
That too is in the old policy, is your shoulders have to be covered.
What's that?
That too is in the old policy.
Oh, I know that. And I said, I'm sorry, don't get me started.
Yeah.
I look forward to the change.
Let's hear from our students. There are going to be some other voices from our committee. They've been waiting patiently, so if you're, or Sophia, did you guys draw straws? I didn't. No, yeah.
Yeah, you
Please
can
come on.
totally
Mr.
say
Harris
that.
has to sit back there, but you can come on.
We try not to be scary, but wherever.
Look, I mean, we're all within the dress code, so.
Had to get dressed up to come in here. I was wearing sweats.
You guys can move closer together too if you want.
You want to orchestrate it for him, we'll just set it.
More importantly, get to where you're comfortable and do whatever you like. We wanna
Put
hear
your
what you
feet
have
up
to
on the
say.
table,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, I first want to say thank you for having us here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I remember in 9th grade when I got my student handbook for the first time, I went through and found the dress code and highlighted the parts I disagreed with, particularly the undue attention kind of part in there. I think I started a few times. So being here is a really cool opportunity for me. There's kind of two things I want to highlight in the same vein. about the dress code, the new one, that I really appreciate, that I think is a really good place to go from. So the first thing is it's a lot more clear and concise. It's definitely shorter. It's also using language, I think, that, well, not like vulgar or explicit in that way, right, is definitely clear and precise as to what can be shown, what can't be shown, what kind of fabric can be like over certain body parts. I mean, there's language in there that is directly describing body parts, right? And I think that's really valuable, right? So for that enforceability piece, that you're then looking at something that is very clear, it's very concise, and that's easy to understand for everyone reading it. And that kind of moves into my second point, which is more from a student perspective. You know, I've never been dress coded, but I've had friends who are, who have been. And I think fundamentally there is no version of that experience that is not in some way embarrassing or upsetting, or kind of hurtful, right? Like, I think something else that's cool about the dress code that we've kind of come up with is it's very focused on clothing and fashion as self-expression, particularly when it relates to that comfortability part, right? You want to be comfortable in a school environment. It's how people learn best, is when they're comfortable. So there's that piece of it, right, too, that you're presenting yourself in a way that expresses who you are, that makes you comfortable in the learning environment you're in, and you're being then called out on the way you're presenting yourself as not being professional or not being appropriate, and that can be really deeply hurtful. And especially there's some weird dynamics, right, too, of this is often targeted at females, it's often male administrators or male teachers, which, you know, that's not intentional per se, but that's how it plays out often, and that can be kind of awkward and weird to navigate too. So I don't think there's any version of getting dress coded that is like fun or not embarrassing, right? I do think that's kind of a crucial, like you're never going to take that piece out, but I think those things can be minimized and they can be mitigated. And I think that is what this dress code does an excellent job of sort of trying to get at and doing, because it has clear, concise language, because it has those precise words, those precise body parts, how they have to be covered, right? You're not looking at a vague document anymore. You're not looking at, well, was it attracting undue attention? Like, how much of your midriff was exposed? Well, my friend wasn't dress coded for the same kind of thing that I'm now wearing this week, and it's like some teachers are enforcing it. Like, there's just all this ambiguity around it, right? And I think that this document does a really, really good job of removing that ambiguity and that lack of precision with precise language, and with language that is acknowledging of clothing as self-expression and is not gendered, right? So I think there's a lot of good pieces that from a student perspective can make that experience less painful, especially because, like, I love to see fashion and clothing as self-expression. Like, I have friends with like super cool senses of style. I tend to go the more like librarian route, you know, I'm definitely a sweater girl at my core, and I'm okay with that. But like I have friends that love to do some really cool stuff with what they wear. And I love seeing their personality come through in that way. And so I like both that this dress code is precise and is enforceable, right? So from an admin perspective, it's probably easier to navigate, and from a student perspective, you know, less embarrassing to be called out on, but also encourages you to be who you are in a school environment, because we are spending a lot of our lives in school, right? At least, you know, from my perspective, where I sit at my age. And so I think having that balance definitely makes it a better environment for all the students that are a part of it.
For me, I think the most important change that was made is how the new dress code is more culturally inclusive. And I think that's really important because over the years, our district has become more culturally diverse, and it's going to continue to become more culturally diverse. And I think it's important to acknowledge that way students can feel more safe and comfortable and understood regardless of their background. And I think that other students will be better served because just overall with this dress code, it gives them like a freedom to express themselves, but like everyone else can still feel comfortable in this environment and like without like being inappropriate or like distracted by anyone else.
going to stick around for a couple more minutes if you have any other questions, but I'll just finish us up with the next steps. So sharing tonight, again, the philosophical underpinnings, if you will, and some previews to what's to come. At our next meeting here at the beginning of March, we'll do our official first read of Policy 221. And then we're going to have at the April board meeting our second read. So that is 2 board meetings. It's a little bit different than sometimes how we do it at a work session and at a board meeting, but this gives us extra opportunity for you to be able to digest it, ask questions that you have, and also to 2 official board meetings where others can come and speak to it if they choose to do so as well. So those are our planned next steps. This last slide, obviously there was some degree of cherry picking of this picture from the yearbook, but the reality is I didn't have to work very hard to find a page. I looked in our most recent yearbook and just said, I want to make sure I have a page that shows a little bit of diversity. I took the picture, I put it in here, and it wasn't until after I put it in here and was looking even deeper at it that I realized what a great depiction of our current school, there we go, school enrollment. Really, it is. This was from last year's senior yearbook, and I think there's a number of things that students are wearing, or that their hair may look like, or any of those kinds of things that are either against our current dress code altogether, or in our careers, many of our careers, students would have been dress coded for, again, including some of the hairstyles. So appreciate the questions you have asked, but certainly if you have other questions or want to discuss more.
Before we go to questions, I just want to say something to the 2 students. It's like early in tonight's meeting, during the data update of the academic programs, there's so much emphasis from the federal government and the state and all kinds of groups on grades and performance and all that. But what I personally, and I think a lot of the board here finds, to me, it's so rewarding is when students like you come forward and take these kind of roles and put the time in to do these adult things, and then come and present for people you have no idea who we are, and you have to feel comfortable doing that and do such a good job. I think that's something that's never measured in testing. It's not measured when the public looks at how well their education dollars are going there. But I think like this is the result of it, and this is the success of public education and this school in particular. So I just want to thank you for the time you put in and your excellent presentation to us. I really enjoyed it. I think everybody else did. So.
Well said.
And hopefully you continue to advocate for change.
Yes, and we agree with
should
you. At least some of us do.
Did we look at PSBA, thank you,
Yeah.
for any guidance there too, or
Yeah.
do they have any?
Yes, so the PSBA policy 221 is actually, so their current policy 221 is quite different than our current policy 221. Obviously, a majority of our policies are very similar to what's been recommended by PSBA. Our current one is vastly different. Our new policy more aligns and incorporates pretty much all of what PSBA has in theirs, with the addition of what we felt was important, which was the value statements and some of the more specifics regarding the dress code that we thought should be spelled out. Again, you'll see that a little bit more next time, but in short, yes, it aligns with PSBA. We also, along the way, but not off the bat, looked at some other model dress codes as well. We wanted to start the conversation without looking at any others, but then after we got the conversation going, then we said, okay, now that we've got some ideas, let's look at what some other school districts might do.
And I would totally agree with what John said, that it's just really great to see you guys come here and knowing that you care enough to do a great job and to come to an end result that your friends will all agree with, and just the fact that you're speaking for so many different people, and everybody's going to appreciate that. So I would say the same thing, that this was a great experience, I hope, for you, and it'll give you the confidence to ever need to make changes someplace else, wherever you go in the future, that you saw how well it was done here, and you'll be able to mimic that again. So that's great background and experience to have, so appreciate it.
Having you on the committee adds a lot of weight to what the final recommendation is going to be, at least from my perspective, versus hearing just from the administration or just some other group, or getting something from outside the community like GSBA, which typically fine, but I think the way this is all framed in terms of what makes the most sense for our students in our community was articulated really well by you and Mr. Harris, but I think that's really, I'm happy to hear what we're going to see next is going to reflect that, so appreciate you coming.
So how much time was devoted to just talking about, oh, should we go to uniforms?
Having been.
I don't think-
I think the only time it was
years of
mentioned
uniforms.
was, the only time it was mentioned was when we said, if we truly believe in professionalism, then it has to be enforced.
Well, don't you worry, you can make uniforms.
Well, that
You
could
can
very
do
well
that.
be too, but.
Living in uniform
Look at the
land.
entire preppy style. You know, prep schools and how far can I push the limit, you know, still be within the Connecticut code, so to speak.
Not that any of us had
Or
ever
Rhode
did
Island.
anything like
Or Rhode
that.
Island.
Not many a time.
Can you still tie a tie with one hand?
Yes, I can.
In less than 7
You make a little
seconds.
clicky, yeah, sure.
No,
Do you have to go to do that in your school?
Yes, I had to wear.
When you're carrying all your books in one arm and running to school tying your tie, yeah.
I can tie a tie blindfolded and have it come out with perfect knot.
Wow.
With the nuns reminding me every second of the way.
and
Let's
he
get to
actually
the
showed
why.
that.
Why
He
are
did
we
it.
doing this? Why?
Very good. Great job. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, ladies. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Fitz and Mr. Harris, for all you've put into that committee. And lastly, we'll go into item, 4.03, school calendar 2023-2024 school year.
So the good news about this is we basically took this year's calendar and rolled it over to next year. We have seen some very positive elements grow out of the calendar. It's changed quite a bit over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm happy to say that much of what you see on this calendar is a result of a lot of work that went in to the calendar that we're currently on. So I'll just step through real quickly for you. Staff opening the week of August 21st, and that gives us Thursday and Friday of that week, which our teachers seem to love that opportunity to either be here or not be here, depending on where they are with their classrooms. And then starting on the 28th with students, if you remember, we talked about the staggered start and the value of the staggered start this past year. We had 2 rounds of the staggered starts for a total of 4 days. Our staff and administrators came back and see value in a staggered start, but not necessarily 4 days. And so we reduced that to 2 days moving forward. Then we go into Labor Day recess in September, pretty straightforward. You see October includes two Act 80 days. The Act 80 days are in addition to the professional development days. Just as a reminder, the Act 80 days are an opportunity for us to work with the staff on a variety of different things. It also is an opportunity to work with our non-instructional staff, which we've made a concerted effort with, and greatly appreciate the work Mr. Bigham and a team has put into trying to find days for professional development for our non-instructional staff, and I think that's been reflected in the survey responses we received to them and appreciated. November, you see the, November 6th, Professional Development Day. That's the second one of the year. There's some early dismissals. That's the half blocks on the 8th and 9th, and that is specific to the middle school only. We have Contracted in Service Day. Again, that is typically a trade-off day for teachers that put time in the summer. And if you put a day in the summer, that's one of the 2 opportunities you have to trade that time off. And then we have the Thanksgiving recess, and no, it hasn't changed since I've been here, including the Monday. And that's not just Mechanicsburg, by the way. That's pretty
Central PA.
Central PA.
It's really not.
And
I was gonna
Western.
say, we haven't
Western
gotten rid of that yet.
Moving along, we'll go to the December winter recess, which is also a tradition that we want to keep alive, is winter recess. And you'll see that there's a second contracted in-service day, again, for the teachers to put in 2 days over the summer. The second contracted in-service day is January 2nd. We go into Martin Luther King and the Act 80 days there. Jump down, I'm just going to keep moving quickly. You see President's Day, Act 80 Day in February. In March, we do try to marry our calendar as much as we can with the Career and Tech Center, with the 13 districts that serve there, as much overlap as we can have in calendars. And March 15th is a good example of a day that we all kind of do a day in March, and there's no particular reason why, and so we agreed on both March 15th and April 19th. It makes CTC's life a lot better when we can come to agreement on that. Spring recess is in March there. It's earlier next year. And May, we have a day for professional development, Memorial Day recess, and at this point we're ending, the last day is on June 6th. You will see this year we had 2 snow days that we didn't do anything with. We think that one of those is going to be plenty, and then we'll move to the FIDS next year. And so next year there will be one, what you would call a traditional snow day, and then from that point on we would go directly into FIDS. Frankly, that has created a little bit of a challenge from a superintendent perspective, because the districts that are immediately going to FIDS are tending to be much quicker at canceling school and turning it to a FID, where we probably would try to bring the students in, but being part of a consortium, being part of the CTC, that is just creating challenges there that I don't think is necessary. So maybe the biggest change in the 2 calendars is instead of 2 traditional snow days and then going to FIDS, it's going to be 1 snow day. So that's the proposed calendar we'd like to bring forward for adoption at the March meeting.
The most complicated thing about the virtual makeup days is what do you teach them? Because you don't know if it's going to be in August or if it's going to be in March.
Right.
So what do you do there? How are we managing that?
Yeah, so believe it or not, even though we've had the opportunity for FIDS, outside of the COVID piece, we've not used a FID. And I say that knowing that probably used 3 of them sometime in March. Yeah, I do remember a couple blizzards in March. Yeah, but so the teachers are aware, they're prepared, and they understand. One of the things that we've done is we're actually on those days running a 2-hour delay schedule that will give the teacher the opportunity to do some preparation for what they would actually have the students do online. But there's no question that it is a significant change in whatever the lesson plan would be. Hopefully the content can be delivered though.
Can you explain the Act 80 days that are only for middle school and high school?
Yeah, so Act 80, different than a professional development day, actually counts as instructional time. It's the Act 80 law that was passed that allows you to put those days in and still count the time for it. For something like the middle school, it's essentially parent-teacher conferences is how it's used, and that's one of the allowable uses of. You see it again in
The high school one is their change of semester.
Yeah, the high school only one is when it's the difference between the 2 semesters, and so it gives teachers an opportunity to transition from semester 1 to semester 2, and then in February.
15th is elementary conference.
Yeah. Shouldn't have taken my glasses.
I got you.
The other one got me.
Any further questions on the school calendar? Right, seeing none. Before we adjourn, I just have a quick question. I thought we had 2 excellent presentations tonight between the swimming pool and also the dress code. It does take a lot of time out of the administration, staff, students to present that, and I get a lot of value out of it personally and to make decisions. And I just want to make sure the consensus of the board was that we're still going in the right direction with that committee approach and the kind of presentations we had tonight on these issues. that we want to continue that kind of direction.
Yes.
Well, with that, meeting is adjourned.